welcome to the Print Soft Cover. I am Purva Chittis, and this is our platform where we launch and talk about new books every now and then. And today we will be talking about another book called Forging Mettle, Nrupender Rao and the Pennar story. Now, this is a book which is by Harper Publications, and this talks about the story of Nrupender Rao, first generation entrepreneur, and his journey, his entrepreneurial journey. And to talk about that, we have with us the author and journalist Pavan Lall, who has in fact penned this book. And to talk about Pavan, in fact, he is a journalist who has worked with different media publications like the Fortune, India, Business Standard, Mint, Dallas Business Journal. So Pavan, welcome to the soft cover and congratulations on your book.
Thanks, Purva. It's great to be here again, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Right. So let's begin our conversation. I'm just curious to first know what made you choose this subject for your book? Like, what was it about Mr. Rao that hit you and you thought that you should write a book, an entire book on him?
Well, you know, the first two books that I've written in the last few years have been on quote unquote bad boys, right? I mean, one was on Nirav Modi, and the second one was of Rana Kapoor at Yes Bank, both who are allegedly white-collar criminals and have made waves and a lot of controversy thanks to their actions around their particular companies. And I thought I'd try something different. And I was looking for a sort of story that was less sensational, but perhaps underreported, undercovered, and often ignored. And I was particularly interested in the Pennar story because of two key reasons. One, that it's a story about a person who is a first-generation entrepreneur. And while his goal is to effectively try and create employment for millions of people and huge revenues, he kind of falls short of his own goal, but he achieves somewhat the same philosophical parameters of creating employment and creating a corporation that has essentially lasted through the extent of his life, despite his challenges. The second reason was really to pick up on the fact that there's a lot of companies that do interesting things and represent the history of our business landscape from down south in markets that often get underreported or not covered as much as companies in the Northwest or in the Midwest, such as Maharashtra or New Delhi. That was the other. Yeah.
So, you know, you've described in your book as well, but if you could tell us, like, how was it when you first met Mr. Rao? Like, if you could talk about his personality and when you met him and you told him about, you wanted to write a book about it. So what was his reaction? How was it?
Well, you know, he first checked me out, and he's currently fighting a very challenging and debilitating neurological condition that doesn't allow him for very much speech, but he sort of communicates with his eyes, or at least I interpret it like that. And you can tell that he's obviously a person who had a tremendous amount of charisma in his youth. And a lot of our communication was done with the help of people around him, as part of his corporation and his family, who were relaying and able to translate back and forth. I think essentially the first meeting was more like one about sort of us both getting to understand where we were coming from. But I think it was almost abundantly apparent from that first very meeting itself that we were pretty much aligned in the kind of story that we were trying to tell. I'll tell you why I say that. He was very well prepared, and he had taken notes over several years about what his journey was going to be like and what was really important for him. His health condition had started to deteriorate several years ago. And so he, like most entrepreneurs, kind of had the vision and the courage to be able to look at himself in the mirror and down the future to realize that, okay, there may be certain things I may not be able to do down the road. And in order to prepare for that, I need to have all my ducks in a row, which is what he did.
If we talk about the book, then, I want to understand that Mr. Rao was his first generation entrepreneur, hailing from a political family. What was it like to be the entrepreneur, and why did he decide to become an entrepreneur and not continue the career or take the route as a political person?
He very much had a political background. His father was a minister in the Congress regime at Andhra Pradesh, erstwhile Andhra Pradesh. And I think, as a young man who was probably one of the earliest, if not the earlier batches at IIT Jamshedpur, he received superior academic training and then went on to get an advanced degree in the United States. And the level of exposure that he had in a developed market at that point in time was probably something that opened his eyes up and led him to want to do something along the lines of becoming a technocrat and coming back to his own country. And instead of going back to a vocation that his ancestors had followed, do something different and be able to create employment. You have to realize 40 years ago, India was a very different place as compared to it is today. And for a young man who's for the first time seeing the Western world, he's obviously very keen to be able to import back some of the good qualities and maybe try and create an entrepreneurial venture out of it.
Also want to understand going ahead. What was like the turning point in Mr. Rao's journey? Was there anything that made him actually, because if we talk about his education, his educational background, he in fact he could have taken the route of going into different companies and becoming successful that way. But what was the turning point in his life?
I think there's actually 2 or 3 key turning points in Mr. Rao's life. First is at a personal level, when he loses his father when he's rather young. Yeah. His father died in his late 50s, and that sort of was a setback for the entire family. It kind of forced him to grow up, right? As we've seen with many other business figures in our country as well. There's several examples, but that sort of leads him to also come to the realization that whatever he's going to do, he's going to have to essentially do it without an advisor or a patriarch to guide him. And that's a major turning point. And in many reasons is also partly one driving factor where we see he works with Nagarjuna, and KVK Raju is kind of a quasi-mentor for him and leads him to start thinking big, which he's already been doing. The second, I would say, big turning point is when he actually branches out on his own, and after having worked for Nagarjuna, which is the erstwhile conglomerate at that point in time, decides to start something similar, but of his own, and takes the plunge into metals and forging, and then decides to go ahead and expand his business. Initially, the business is obviously doing very well, as we've detailed in the book. The third turning point actually comes in the form of what you could describe as a setback when he opens an aluminum plant and factory in Maharashtra. And it's a big move because he's invested a lot of money in it. He's trying to expand and actually go beyond the borders of South India, which is a significantly aggressive as well as ambitious play. And you have a shift in policy as well as duties and regimes that leads the plan to basically come dismantled and causes the whole venture to sort of come stalling in its tracks. And I think defeat at that stage in his career sort of teaches him that, okay, you just have to keep up and get going and focus on what you can do and not let it break you.
Right. But was there support for his journey from his family? How was it from his family point of view? Was there good support from his own family and also, like his father and others in the family?
Mr. Rao comes from the Velamma community in the south, which is essentially a business community and in some part a land holding community. But he certainly wasn't ultra wealthy as you may define it in today's context. You have to realize politicians in those days were cut of an entirely different breed. They were not as invested in large corporations as they might be today. They didn't have parallel businesses running. They also had, as a country, India had just come off the back of 1947, where, the Gandhi regime had implemented things like a land ceiling act. So people were fairly conscious, and we were in an era of conservatism in some ways, right? I mean, there was a slightly socialist mindset, there was a slightly communist mindset in some states, and a lot of it was frowned upon to be very wealthy. So no, he didn't have tremendous wealth that came backing him. In fact, he used whatever money he had. He took bank loans. He took risks on his own and built the company step by step. Yeah.
And then shifting to the Pennar story itself, he bought that company which wasn't very profit making. If you could tell us more about that, what was it like? And
it was actually a dead company. It was a company in name only. It had been started by two other parties, and it hadn't really taken off. And in those days, again, the whole single window clearance of starting a company is not like it is today, where you and I can pretty much go and start a company in 20 or 30 days, or maybe even less, if it's not heavily regulated, right? In those days, it was pretty much the license Raj, and you had to wait in turn. So what a lot of companies did, not just Mr. Rao, but many entrepreneurs, many businesses would look for corporations or entities that had been started, but for some reason have been abandoned, or they went bust, or they were not taking off, or the owners had lost interest. And then they would pick up those companies. They were kind of like shell companies in a sense, but they had not taken off. So that's what he did at that point.
But then it would have its own challenges, right? Since it was debt making, how did he turn it around?
Well, he had a lot of know-how that he had picked up from KVK Raju at Nagarjuna. And don't forget, he had worked for Coromandel Chemicals as well before that. He had worked for CMS in the United States. He was extremely well qualified, had roped in a strong team, and he's not in his 20s by the time he's doing all these things, right? So he's got a body of experience of work and is sort of hitting his stride and has the capability to be able to sort of stitch it all together and get the ball rolling, so to speak.
So does that help, like having that experience, if you would like to give that advice to some young entrepreneur going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at a lot of large corporations in say the 80s, they were created by individuals or entrepreneurs who had some level of exposure externally, and then maybe come back or gone back and forth and seen how business was run in the West. There's a number of companies like that, right? And I mean, take, for example, Reliance, right? Mukesh Ambani, to a large extent, got his higher education in the United States. He may not have stayed on there and worked, but what he saw probably did give him some level of exposure when he came back, and then gave him, I'm sure, fuel for ambition to sort of expand what his father had already built for him, which he's done, of course, in recent years.
So his US experience was also something that he used in his journey?
Absolutely. I would say absolutely. I think it's an extremely short but defining a sort of milestone for his career, because in the context of the conversations that he has with his college friends and with his employers and his colleagues, it's pretty obvious that, the Americas are moving in one track, whereas India is perhaps getting stuck in license Raj and not really expanding. And so you have a young man who's full of fire and energy, who wants to take his newfound wisdom and come back to his home country and do something that will essentially benefit not just the economy, but also its people and him, and therefore have a win-win situation for all. It's an interesting point. When at one stage he wants to sort of consider doing an advanced degree and stay on in the US, and his father says to him, well, I think you'll be better suited to come back. You're needed over here. And then you see that shift as well kick in. So, yeah.
Yeah, and basically, when he started off and his kind of era that it was there, in India, socialism was dominant as against, the market forces or capitalism, which we see today. So maybe probably for young entrepreneurs or for people who are starting now, it is comparatively easier, if I may just have to compare it. But how difficult was it for him to, establish something of his own when nobody in his family had any experience of setting up a business?
I don't think it was too difficult, like I said, because he's got the experience coming in from Nagarjuna, where he's worked for a few years. By this time, Nrupender Rao is a highly qualified engineer with an MBA, and he's had global exposure. So he's got the know-how, right? And he knows what to do, as well as having worked with the Indian side with an entrepreneur like KVK Raju, who was actually in his time seen as a visionary and extremely successful. So he's managed to accumulate both his sets of experiences in those different directions. and then combine them to start something of his own that he thinks he can scale up, right? Was it difficult at that point in time? To some extent, I believe it would have been extremely difficult to scale, which is where he did run into some difficulties. But I think the difficulties were not just because of the scale factor. I think they were because of a very important reason, which is, in some senses, he also willy-nilly, unwittingly gets caught between two shifting policy regimes, right? So you have somebody who's a technocrat who comes in, who's used to the business economy working in the license Raj, and then suddenly the markets from the 80s move into 1991, and you know what happens over there. We move into liberalization, and economic reforms start to open up, and our political regimes shift. So suddenly you're seeing an entirely different way of doing business. And for somebody who's grown up in one mindset and way of thinking, making that sudden change isn't that easy.
So how did he manage that shift?
Well, with difficulty, right? I mean, if you look at what we talk about in the book, obviously he was caught off guard, and he's not able to, at that point in time, grasp the quick shift and the tectonic changes in the policy. But he figures out that, okay, it doesn't mean that the road ends over here. And he goes back to business after stomaching those losses, after dealing with those defeats, and he's pushing ahead with his other ventures. So, currently, at this stage, you have a situation where he's come full circle, right? He's seen a brief high when he starts. He's seen a number of lows, or a few lows in his career, or rather early in his career. And then there's a constant and steady but strained process of rebuilding, which is now sort of coming to fruition.
Okay. And, Pavan, what advice would you like to give people who would want to pick up this book and read? Like, why should they actually read and care about his story? I mean, we've spoken about it at length, but, in a nutshell, if you want to summarize it, why should anyone pick up this book and read about Nrupender Rao, who's not very well known, but yes, an important figure?
That's a great question, and I'll answer it very directly. A lot of the time, I think our media and our society is chasing big success, big billions, big numbers, and really high-profile businesses. And there's a lot of management lessons that come also from seeing the other side of business, which is highs and lows and defeat at times. It's not that Nrupender Rao has only seen defeat; he's also seen his share of success, which we've talked about at length in the book. But I think the actual kernel of wisdom that I've managed to take away from this particular experience is that, in many ways, he's a sort of a underrated management guru whose lessons hold good for all time. I mean, he's doing things like talking about CSR/ESG, which is now such a buzzword in all our corporate boardrooms, right? You have everybody from Blackstone and other large investors, as well as companies, having ESG meetings, and you have ESG courses at the Harvards of the world. But in many ways, what he was doing then, which is about sustainability, about governance, about the environment, and about, most importantly, how he treated his people, seems to have a telling message.
Right. And, lastly, I would like to ask you if, since you've written about Nrupender Rao in this book, is there any possibility that we might just see more such entrepreneurs that you would be writing about?
I would actually love to be doing that. And I think the key is to find people who have sort of a unique story and not a story that is formulaic, I mean, it's all very well to talk about stories that are, textbook or classic cases of, how they start very small and then, hit the ball out of the park and become overnight billionaires, right? I think that's become a bit of a cliche. I think there's one other important facet I'd like to touch upon, which is, you might want to ask how did Rao keep going throughout all the downtime and through the defeats and all the hard knocks that he took, right? And I think his own personal set of values and a certain spiritual side of the business, right, which is that you continue to essentially just focus on what you can control, what you can do, and keep working and look after your people, goes a long way, especially in a country like India.
Yeah, he was like socially aware as well, and even in his business, it's important that you just don't focus on profitability. In fact, if you focus on ethics and certain values into your business, profitability comes out, and that in fact is the message through his story that I'm sure you're trying to give as well.
Absolutely. And I would just, quickly summarize and say that, you have a lot of companies and a lot of executives who talk about looking after their people. But I mean, the last 2 or 3 years, you and I have enough stories about how companies are fairly ruthless in axing jobs and slashing salaries and laying people off despite murmurs from the government and the state telling our business audience to look after their people. Not everybody did it, right? And I'm not saying that Nrupender Rao did not have to let people go, but he did it in a manner that was humane. He looked after them as far as possible, even to his own loss, to his own cost, where he had to dispose of his private lands in order to make good. And I think that speaks for something,
Yeah. And it's interesting, like, how you've kept this book very simple for anyone to read it. And it is not about, typical big business jargons, but this is a story about a man and his journey and how he, in fact, lived through his years, like through ups and downs, he's carved a niche for himself. So, this is about a 200 odd page book, and which we would recommend our viewers and readers to just pick it up and read it. So thank you so much, Pavan, for your time. And once again, congratulations for this book.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.